different countries, Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish.
Well, I don't know if they'll necessarily be 3 different countries. Obviously, it would be best if we could use some type of federal or even confederate system where there's shared power. But this is quite clear, and it was predictable, that if you invade Iraq, these were some of the similar reasons that Snowcroft used back in the early 90s why not to invade Baghdad, is because it would break down into sectarian violence, and that these people would want to have their own sovereignty. And what was the result of that? An emboldened Iran. This isn't new foreign policy, and that's exactly what's happened. I'm an advocate of going in, using more force, helping with diplomacy to get some shared power, some self-government, and get the area stabilized so that we can redeploy.
Okay, we can't back up on that decision. We hope we can move forward, but America went into Iraq on the pretext of eliminating weapons of mass destruction. There weren't any. It was a landmark decision for this country to launch a preemptory attack on a nation. Do you support the doctrine of preemptory attack?
I'm an advocate of the POW doctrine, which was not followed in this war. I thought it was more rational for us to invade in the early 90s. We had more international support. It was more morally justified.
But again, in another country, looking ahead.
Looking ahead.
Look, would you invade another country if we felt there were any?
Well, I would never take anything off the table.
Okay.
But at the same time, I think that in this situation, it was unwarranted because we didn't follow the POW doctrine.
Mr. Cannon, your position there?
The problem with the POW doctrine is that we don't want to give terrorists a geographic base to operate. And the reason all the countries in the UN supported what we did in Iraq is because we were going in to prevent Al-Qaeda from taking over a place where they could hide and protect themselves and train people and project their viciousness on us.
But it seems to have backfired in Iraq.
Well, it hasn't backfired. It just hasn't worked out as well as we'd hoped. But the fact is we went in with overwhelming force and we won the war. And now we have a longer-term problem. And that long-term problem is a battle with extremists within a religion that are going to try and convert us all by the sword.
Well, the National Intelligence Estimate says the Iraq War has made the overall terrorism problem worse.
No, that is the New York Times quoting a narrow piece. That's not what the report says. The report says that in general there's improvement, but this has created a trend. In fact, that quote went directly to the recruitment within Iraq and in the Arab world of people that come to Iraq and fight us, which is, of course, vindicating what the president said about being better to fight them and kill them in Iraq than in America. That's just a choice, and I think the report is consistent with what I've just said, as opposed to the rather extreme position that was propounded by the New York Times.
Okay. Well, our response to the website at KSL.com says that's the biggest issue on voters' minds. Absolutely. Is the war in Iraq. Let's move on to some others. These questions sent in on our website to any Republican candidate from Andy Neal. So we'll start with you, Mr. Cannon. President Bush uses as the basis for many of his security measures broad leeway, he says, was given to him by Congress and the Constitution as part of his war powers. Carrying this logic, what doesn't the president have authority to do?
What Congress stops him from doing, and that's an important fact. Now, I think this question is probably done in the context of military tribunals and what we're going to do to prisoners who, by the way, these are not like German soldiers who were forced to go into the army. They weren't wearing
uniforms.
They aren't wearing uniforms. They're not wearing uniforms like the German soldiers did. They're not taken captive and treated like the same way. These are people who know about plans to hurt civilians and hurt children and blow up innocents. And so the question is, do we have to deal with them the same way we deal with people under the Geneva Convention? And the answer is absolutely not. Now, the Supreme Court came out and said that the president couldn't do what he had been doing without congressional approval. And he just signed. In fact, he invited me back because of the role I played on the Judiciary Committee for the signing of the military tribunals bill the other day. And now he has that authority. So I think that what the person is questioning, it really goes to how Congress and the executive branch operate together, and I think we've shown that we can do a pretty good job there.
Were you comfortable with that act, Mr. Burridge?
Well, I'm concerned about what's been going on with the lack of separation of powers that we've had in this country. This Congress has been labeled the do-nothing Congress. It's been worse than what Truman criticized back several years ago.
I think you're missing Congress. This Congress has done an enormous amount of legislation, just truly an enormous amount, all the way from limiting frivolous lawsuits to...
You can spin it all you want, but this has been labeled the do-nothing Congress. By the media.
Nancy Pelosi, whose agenda hasn't advanced, you're right.
Look, this has been labeled the do-nothing Congress. It's only worked 86 days. I was told the other day that you're making like $1,100 a day to be in Congress, and it's the least active Congress in history. And the fact is that this Congress has not done any oversight. It's done the least oversight. And lately, we've just had the revocation of habeas corpus. And the problem with that is that if you don't have your rights to habeas corpus, you don't have any of your other constitutional rights. The habeas corpus does not exist to protect the terrorists. It protects the people that may be accused of terrorism that are innocent. And if we don't have those standards in our society, what are we in Iraq and throughout the world fighting for? We have to fight for our Constitution, and we've got to fight for the principles that this country stands for. And since we don't have any oversight, and since we haven't had separation of powers, this has been a tragic failure when it comes to defending our Constitution. And I condemn the president for doing that.
I think you're going to find Congress is a little harder than the days that were actually in session.
Well, here's a question for Mr. Burridge from a viewer, Troy Tanner of Magna. He says, are you for tax increases? If not, how are you going to debate this with your fellow Democrats who are in favor of tax increases? What's your answer to
Taxes are a dynamic issue. But I do believe that we need to have tax cuts for the middle class and for small businesses. And these corporate windfalls and these millionaire windfalls that have come out of this Congress are outrageous. I see it every day in my law practice. What's happening in this Congress is there's a war on the middle class. They're trying to distribute all the taxes on the payroll tax, and meanwhile, gut corporate taxes and gut all high-end earner taxes. Where much is given, much is required. There are lots of rich individuals and there are lots of corporations that use many services in this country that average individuals do not use. And this attack on the middle class, where they're trying to shift the tax burden on only people that get paid through a payroll, is an assault, and it's bad for our middle class. And you can see the erosion of the middle class because of the policies of this Congress.
Mr. Cannon, I'm kind of a terribly old-fashioned guy in that I don't spend any more than I earn, and Congress seems not similarly constrained. What happened to the Republicans as being the fiscally responsible party?
We actually cut government spending in 1996, just before I got to Congress, and we lived off that for a great deal of time. We actually paid down the deficit by about $750 billion. Then we had tax cuts, we had a recession, and we had the war in Iraq. And still, I mean, with all due respect to tax cuts, no poor man ever provided a job for another man. You need people that have capital to create jobs, and this economy has been remarkable. The deficit is way less than 1/2 of what it was projected to have been 5 years ago, because the economy has been so robust and people have, thank heavens, jobs. Here in Utah, we're at under 3% unemployment. That's because of Republican policies. And so tax cuts have been good, deficits are much less than they have been, and we're moving back to an environment where we actually live within our budget.
Should we make those tax cuts permanent? The president
Absolutely.
Absolutely. What do you think, Mr. Burridge?
Absolutely not.
No.
What has happened is there's been a huge windfall to the richest 1% of our country. Corporations are not paying their fair share. There's incentives in our tax code right now for people to take American jobs overseas. It's absolutely eroding people's buying power that are average, everyday citizens. And the policies from the very beginning are to consolidate wealth in the hands of a few while the middle class shrinks. And the middle class is the hallmark of the greatest civilization in the history of the world. And we need to protect that in America because it is good for our national security, and it's good for prosperity for not only the middle class and the poor, but also for the rich, because the middle class are the ones that spend the money. When you consolidate wealth, it doesn't necessarily get reinvested in the economy. Even President Bush I called this trickle-down theory that my opponent's advocating for as voodoo economics. It doesn't work, but they've been doing it since they've gotten in power, and it's an irrational
We
policy.
actually sort of agree on this, but can I just add another comment?
Sure.
In the first place, the rich don't pay taxes. They've already made their money. The people that get taxed are the people that are getting rich and building jobs, and that's just a fact of life. But Mr. Burridge actually makes a point which I think is important. We're not at a point where the disparity between the rich and the poor is greater than ever. And that's in part because we've got rich people who are learning to become rich, and that's, I think, beneficial, generally speaking. But Barney Frank, who's a Democrat from Massachusetts, I wrote an article in Business Week, probably in April of this year, suggesting that that's a problem, and if Republicans who've got, conservatives who've got good ideas, and he admitted that many of our ideas are good, would work with him to help limit or minimize that disparity, that we could end up, so he would end up supporting or bringing support for our conservative ideas. Now that's hopefully the